my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Brandi Janssen, a cultural anthropologist who is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Occupational and Environmental Health in the University of Iowa College of Public Health, and she also serves as the director of the Iowa Center for Agricultural Safety and Health. So this is very interesting also for me, how to combine, how to harmonize being critical anthropologist and to work as director at such center, right? Where you have a lot of other people from other disciplines, agronomists and so on. So yeah, her scholarly research focuses on the production and marketing strategies of direct market farmers in Iowa. And as an anthropologist by training, she still collects, let's say, qualitative ethnographic data on alternative small-scale farming in Iowa, very agricultural state, to better understand what makes local food systems successful and safe. So she's the author of this book, and I will share this book with you. This is my book, okay? So don't take it away. Okay, you can start here. So yeah. So this book is titled The Challenges and Opportunities of Today's Small Farmers. And this book actually debunks some myths about the local food system, such as the narrative of the little guy who is going up against corporate agriculture. Okay? So the book shows that on the ground, on the field, things are much less combative than they seem to be, and that almost all farmers, big, small, organic, conventional, whatever, combine different strategies, that there are commodity farmers, for instance, doing small community-supported agriculture, and quite the opposite. So as director of ICASH, so this Center of Agricultural Safety and Health, she tries to relate what we perceive as food, health, and safety to the workplace. And we usually forget that farmers and farm workers are dealing with real equipment, dangerous environment, that even organic farming isn't free of chemicals, that there are a lot of disinfectants and sanitizers that can cause all sorts of problems, and for instance, the equipment, the livestock, etc. So it's just as dangerous as on a big farm. So in today's presentation, with quite challenging and promising title, good luck with your research. I hope you find what you are looking for, what farmers set usually on the ground, right? Lessons learned from Iowa farmers. Brandi will reflect on her more than 15 years of doing ethnographic research among farmers in the state of Iowa, so how different types of farmers interact with each other and with other types of farming practices and so on, and how farmers engage with federally funded research. This is our usual challenge, how to persuade them to collaborate, because usually they ask, what are benefits of this talking to you? And yeah, so I hope that Brent will explain that.
We'll try.
It's your floor.
Okay, thank you so much. My friend and wonderful host and good friend and collaborator it has been. And thank you so much for having me. I will try to speak slowly. I, like many researchers, I will try not to do that. Feel free to interrupt me if I'm going too fast or you have any questions. It is hard to, I had to make some choices as I think about what do I want to tell this audience about all of my years of work with farmers. And of course, I want to tell you everything, and I can't. So I will try to speak slowly and clearly, but please don't, please feel free to interrupt if you have questions or if I'm not being clear enough. So yes, I won't introduce myself anymore because Duška just gave you a nice overview of my work, but I will tell you a little bit about where I come from in the US. I am originally from the state of Missouri, which is smack in the middle. Most of you, if you've been to the US, you've been on the coast. I say you should come to the middle. That's where it's really interesting. You have to come to the middle of the United States, and that's where I am from, in the state of Missouri. And more specifically, in a region called the Ozarks, which is a mountainous region. Duška's Marian is a geographer. We've talked about topography a lot. It's not a fault line mountain system, but a plateau that has been carved out by glaciers. It's very hilly. Your northern regions in Slovenia although much larger, it's similar, right? We are from the hills. This is where I come from. It's very rural. I grew up on a farm with cattle. That photograph is my father with a very large bull. They were good friends, he and the bull, and he would go out and he would brush, which I do not recommend as a safety and health professional. It's very dangerous. But that was him with the bull on our farm in the Ozarks. So that's where I started as a farm kid, growing up with animals, not crops. And there's specifically where our farm was located, just north of the Lake of the Ozarks in that region in Missouri. Now I moved one state up. Now I'm in Iowa, also in the middle, the best part of the United States, which you should all visit. Very different landscape, much flatter, very rolling, not flat, but very rolling, and so much corn. So much corn, you would not believe it. I still don't believe it, and I've been there years and years, and it still astonishes me how much corn we grow. I came to Iowa first to attend a small college in the central part of the state called Grinnell College. I was one of the first in my family to go to college. My parents did not go to college. And then later went back to the University of Iowa for a master's and PhD in anthropology from our Department of Anthropology. I stayed there, but then moved for my employment to our College of Public Health to oversee the center focusing on agricultural safety and health among farmers. So I came in as a social scientist. Some of us have already chatted about being one social scientist in a world of quantitative scientists, toxicologists, and industrial hygienists. I am an N of one. But as I say, I speak farmer. I understand sort of the cultural practices of farming, and that's one of my contributions, I think, to our college. So that's where I am now, and I direct ICASH, Iowa Center for Agricultural Safety and Health, as well as being a faculty member and teaching courses and all of the other things that go along with that life. So Iowa, you may have heard of us. We grow some corn and some soybeans, and we have a lot of pigs. Just under 85,000 farm operations. I think I've done my math right to convert from acres to hectares, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. The vast majority of the state is covered with agricultural land. We used to be a prairie, a very complex ecosystem of flowers and deep-rooted forbs. It created beautiful topsoil, which now we exploit and grow corn and soybeans on. Most of the prairie is gone, very sadly. So our corn worth about almost I have a typo there. There should be 3 more zeros. $17 billion. And soybeans worth just over $8 billion. So if Iowa were a country, if we were an autonomous state, we would be 4th in the world in corn and soybean production, behind Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. It is mind-blowing, the quantity. And we're not that much bigger in landmass than Slovenia, right? And we produce all this corn. We have a lot of pigs, 24 million pigs. If you come to Iowa, oddly, you will not see pigs. Why? Because they are all in houses. They are in confined animal feeding operations, right? So they are confined for from day one until they go to slaughter at about 300 pounds. But there are 24 million of them tucked away. There are only 3 million Iowans. So, almost 7 pigs per person, right? If you come to Iowa, you get 7 pigs, right? That's not true. So yes, it's just an enormous scale of production that even as someone who's lived there a long time, I still find sort of mind-blowing. So I'm going to share some lessons that I have learned in doing qualitative and ethnographic research with farmers over the years. Some of this is sort of traditional health and safety research. Some of it focuses on social support and mental health, but not all of it. Some of it also comes from my research in alternative food systems and different supply chains. But I think what I feel and what I believe is that all of these lessons inform how I approach our work at ICASH and how we think about developing programs that are really supportive of farmers. I try to draw from all of this content. It doesn't have to be health and safety research to understand something about farmers' lives and experiences. So my 4 lessons, first, and I will have examples of these, right? I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by independence in farming, and in the US, we talk about independence a lot. That's kind of one of our things. I think Slovenia here too. But how those sort of farm practices that we imagine as being independent and focused on the farm actually come from somewhere else, right? Those off-farm pressures are very important. Iowa agriculture is not just one thing or the other. Sometimes we put farmers in camps. They're organic and they're conventional, or they're this or they're that. But in reality, as Duška said in the intro, there's a lot of overlap. They're blended, right? Farmers make decisions about how they blend practices. As a qualitative researcher, I'm always very interested in sort of reading between the lines and recognizing that when a farmer tells you, I don't have time, there's something more there and you should ask about it, right? You should dig a little deeper. So there's usually barriers to change, whether it's health and safety or whether it's production practices are more than what they initially seem. And finally, and this is a project I really enjoyed very much, we learned a lot about how farmers engage with federally funded research, how they engage with science, particularly health science, which is a little different than agronomy or other scientific agriculture. So a little bit of framing. I won't belabor this because it's sort of, theory. Oh, we're so weary of it. I tend to think about a lot of the work I do with farmers in the context of agrarianism. And by agrarianism, I don't mean just rural life, but a very specific and pretty American perspective called Jeffersonian agrarianism. So our second president, Thomas Jefferson, he was operating in the context, first of all, of global revolution, right? The French Revolution was happening at the time. And he looked over at France and he's like, whew, we do not want that to happen here, right? We have just gotten our act together as a very young country and we want to keep it that way. And his perspective was that the solution is agriculture, and specifically independent landowners who will be stable, they will stay put, and they will be loyal. They will not rise up like those industrial workers in France. They will be loyal. So this is really the core. And we often forget the loyalty piece in the US. That's a kind of an interesting bit of this. So focusing on private property, right? So if farmers have land, if they own land, and it is independently managed, right? They will be stable, they will be loyal, they will stay put, they will be self-sufficient. The household then becomes an economic unit of production. That's how they make contributions, not as workers, but as farmers. And the central premise is really that this type of work, of farming, is more valuable than labor, right? So we tend to separate our farming economy from our economy of other types of labor, and we value that farm economy. And we forget, in our myth, we ignore the fact that paid labor is part of farming. It's critical to getting the work done. We do need paid labor. And our current system, as more modern theorists think about what agrarianism means in the United States, we often forget that farmers, in many ways, are operating as laborers because they are parts of large multinational corporations. So we present to them sort of this view of independence and self-sufficiency when they really, in many cases, and hog production is a very good example of this, operate as laborers for external corporations. So that's sort of where, when I start to put what I learn from farmers into some context, this is often what I fall back on, are these ideas of agrarianism that are very rich in both our popular notions of farming in the US, but also in our scholarly literature. Lesson 1, off-farm interests drive farm practices. This map comes from an NGO, a non-governmental organization called the Environmental Working Group, and they track farm subsidies. So as in many places, here included, farms are very heavily subsidized. And during our last presidential administration, who will not be named, there was an enormous boost in subsidies. We started a trade war with China, you might remember, which was really problematic for farmers. So in response, the government said, we'll just pay them. We'll pay them off. And so almost half of farm income in Iowa and nationally came from federal subsidies. So the darker the county, and this is county level map here, the darker the county, the higher the proportion of subsidies. But what's important about this is that we have a very narrow policy structure for what we subsidize. So if you are a subsidized farmer, you grow corn, soy, wheat, rice, or cotton. Those 5 things. Those are our 5 subsidized products. So when a farmer, especially a large farmer in Iowa, is thinking about what should I produce, the structure is there for corn and soybeans. There's a policy structure for it, which makes change really difficult. So despite sort of ideas about maybe being independent and independent producers, the decisions they're making are largely driven by this external policy structure that says, we'll pay you to grow corn, we'll pay you to grow soybeans. We won't pay you to grow other things, so why would I do that, right? This also informs mechanization, right? If the companies that produce farm equipment know that farmers are getting paid to grow corn, they're going to make more equipment for people to grow corn, and it's going to be harder to find equipment for something else, right? So it winds up informing the whole structure, and you're operating independently in the structure that's actually really narrow and defines what you're going to do, right? A few years ago, I was driving across Iowa, which is a beautiful drive, and when you all visit, you will see how lovely it is. It's very open, the sky is very big, and I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about growing sunflowers. And as I was hearing this, I was imagining my drive across Iowa if it were covered in sunflowers. Wouldn't that be something? And I was like, oh, that would be beautiful. Well, why don't we grow sunflowers in Iowa? They grow sunflowers in the Dakotas. That's not that far away. Sunflowers are wonderful. They have a deep root structure. They would be better for our soil than corn and soybeans. Well, who has access to equipment for sunflowers? Nobody. Where is there a processor for sunflowers? Nowhere close. So I could grow sunflowers, and they grow wonderfully in Iowa, but I'd have nowhere to take them to process them. Going back to my previous slide about what types of production are supported, nobody's supporting sunflowers. So there's no infrastructure for it. So operating independently is sort of only within the confines of what I have, what's being paid for through subsidy programs, and then what are the support systems that come from somewhere else? What kind of inputs can I get? What kind of equipment do I need? Do I have to buy something new? It's very expensive to buy new equipment. That's what it would cost. And even though if I were a farmer, I could make a whole lot more money on sunflowers than I can on corn. It is a high value, high margin crop, right? But even for that difference, if the government is paying me to grow corn and I have equipment for corn, why would I change? So I've spent a lot of my time working with farmers who don't grow commodities, who grow food that we eat. We don't eat any of the corn, by the way, that we grow in Iowa. It goes into our gas tanks and it goes for pigs. But some farmers do actually grow food, which is a specialty crop. Food, only in America, right? But even these very short supply chains are really complicated. Our narrative in the US about local food, alternative agriculture, emphasizes the farmer and the consumer. And we have all these advertising campaigns, know your farmer, know your food, right? They're on bumper stickers, and that's sort of on your tote bag that you get at the farmer's market. You have this phrase. But the reality is, even in these very, very short supply chains, there are all sorts of other actors, right? There are all sorts of other regulators that might be at your market. If you sell at a farmer's market, there will be regulations about everything from the types of products you can sell to how high off the ground you have to put your stand. You can't set food on the ground. It's dirty, apparently. That you can't start selling before the market bell rings. You know, there are all these rules and structures. So as a consumer, I don't see those. I think, I'm having an uncontrolled interaction with a farmer. I know my farmer. No, your farmer's there and all the structure is set up by the market and you can't see it. You just don't know it, right? There are inspection structures particularly for dairy and meat, right? So if I go and I buy a cut of meat directly from a farmer, that farmer has already engaged with the state of Iowa to make sure that his or her freezer is inspected and that it's all up to regulation, right? So that's already interrupted my, free interaction with a farmer. We can produce, sometimes on-farm slaughter has a whole set of regulations around it. If you process fewer than 1,000 poultry, for example, a year, you can do it on your farm, but everything else has to go to a locker, to a processor, before it gets back to the consumer. And in addition, there is a whole narrative of media and public awareness. So The many farmers who get into direct marketing thinking, if I do this, I will be able to capture the whole margin, the whole profit margin. It will not go to middlemen. But then they find that maybe they don't want to be marketers. Maybe they don't like dealing with customers. Sometimes they learn. So they rely a lot on media and public awareness about local food to do that work for them, right? So that structure, that also controls our discussions. So in thinking about sort of this lesson one, right? Our notions of agrarianism that tend to prioritize farmers as independent, self-sufficient actors outside of these other systems, it's because those systems are invisible, sometimes purposely so, I would argue. So this distances farmers from the structures. We don't see the structures that affect their work, right? We think they're these independent actors, but in reality, they're also part of this system that affects how they do their work. Our ideas of agrarian hide the structural realities of subsidized production, for example, which control the types of products that farmers are growing. And it also hides the very complex system that actually facilitates those farmer and consumer relationships that appear kind of unsullied by external forces, but in fact are also controlled by broader systems. So farmers are not as independent as they seem. Sometimes you can't tell them that, by the way. You want to be a little careful because they certainly view themselves as very independent. Lesson 2, Iowa agriculture is not a binary system. This is another kind of, it's easy to fall back in this language, right? You are a conventional producer or you're an organic producer. You grow local food or you grow commodities, right? You sort of have these two very simple systems and you're one or the other. You're in two camps. But what I've found over the years, and I could give you a lot of examples, this is an area where I've squashed it down to 2, of sort of where these systems inform each other, where they blend in neighborhoods, on farms, etc. And one is in the world of health and safety. So when I first took on my job as the director of iCash, I had just finished my PhD research, which became the book, Making Local Food Work. And I was sitting with this farmer, actually, at a meeting, and I was telling him about this center that I was directing, my new job. I was very excited about it. I said, yes, traditionally the center has mostly worked with commodity farmers, corn and soybean growers, the big farmers, right? I said, but I see some opportunities. I hope that we can also work with smaller scale farmers. And he looked at me and he said, well, what could hurt you on a vegetable farm? I said, do you have a tractor? That's it right there. He said, I do. That's like the worst thing you can have on your farm. This is terrible. This thing will kill you, right? Narrow front wheels, no rollover protection, hydraulics in the back. What could hurt you on a vegetable farm? There it is, right there. But even as a farmer, right, he had these ideas that his small vegetable farm was very different from the commodity growers. Those farm accidents only happen to the big commodity growers. Not true at all, right? You have the piece of equipment that is sort of the leading cause of death on farms. It's right there on your farm too. It's not so different, right? These things are very similar. As Dushka pointed out, there's also some consumers also sort of have this view, right? If it's local or if it's organic, it's the healthier food choice, and maybe it's also the healthier farm. But there are lots of chemicals on organic farms, disinfectants and cleaners, but also naturally derived chemicals and pesticides, right? Those are certainly present on organic farms. The equipment issue is certainly true on vegetable farms and small farms. And crises of mental health are just as prevalent on small-scale farms. So we sort of imagine, right, the small farm is living the good life, right, the bucolic agrarian experience. But I can tell you, particularly among farmers who do what we call community-supported agriculture, where you pay a farmer in advance and then you get a subscription of food. You're nodding, maybe you've heard of this as well. In our region, there is this annoying little gap smack in the middle of the season. You have spring things, right, your early snap peas and asparagus, garlic scapes maybe, through about now into June. And then there's this pause. And there isn't a lot available until our summer things come on. The green beans and the tomatoes and the corn, and those we do grow some sweet corn, the six ears of sweet corn that we grow in all the commodity corn. And there's this pause, there's this gap in the middle, and farmers say, people have paid me in advance, and now I have this gap in my subscription. What do I do, right? Or farmers who have had environmental problems. We had a year of terrible floods a few years back, and a couple of those small-scale vegetable farmers, they could not complete their obligations to their customers because so many of their products washed away. This was so destructive to them. It was so stressful. They were, wondering why they were doing this work, right? So when we think about sort of the issue of suffering and mental health and behavioral health, the small-scale farmers are just as vulnerable to some of those issues as the larger-scale farmers. They are not one or the other. So lots of things could hurt you on a vegetable farm, is what I told this guy. The other farm I'll talk a bit about is this very interesting, what I would say large-scale organic farm. They're in northeast Iowa. He's produced organic grains for many years. So organic corn and soybeans. The corn goes into organic feed, the organic feed supply. The soybeans, when I spoke with him, he was supplying to Silk, which is our soy beverage company. I shouldn't say soy milk because that confuses people, but we make this milk-like substance out of soybeans, and that's what he sold it to. So this is definitely part of our alternative world of agriculture in Iowa. But he also raised 44,000 turkeys on contract with Sara Lee. So Sara Lee is a grocery store brand. You can purchase sliced turkey lunch meats and things like that. I think they also do bakery goods. I don't know, they're a big food corporation. So this is an arrangement where, the farmer puts up the capital to build the barn, the confinement. It's one big long building. He signs a contract with Sara Lee, which outlays every detail of the production practice. There is no choice here. There's no independence. Even down to he can't have a pet bird in his house. You couldn't have a canary or a parakeet or a house bird because these birds are so genetically similar and they are so fragile to disease that you can't have anything like that in your home. He also had some beef cattle as a sideline. He was very excited about the Sara Lee contract, and when I met with him and interviewed him, this was fairly recent, because it gave an extra enterprise on the farm for his son. So he hoped that this would help his son engage in the farm and give him an income stream that then he could continue to work on the farm. But there was one thing he was very excited about. He had negotiated with Sara Lee. You don't usually negotiate with people like Sara Lee, right? They say, here is the contract. Here are your expectations. You do this. We'll buy those 44,000 turkeys when they are ready to go. But in the meantime, you do what we say. But of course, one of the reasons he wanted to add this enterprise to his farm was because he wanted the nitrogen and the fertilizer that would come out of the barn, right? We do use our confinement, too much of it. It's a whole nother lecture about what we do with all that hog manure that comes from all those pigs. But in this case, he wanted to use this manure and the bedding on his crops because he can't use synthetic nitrogen. He can't use the anhydrous ammonia that most of our farmers use because it's not the organic product. But he could use turkey manure. But the bedding that was required by his contract wasn't what he wanted. It was not ideal for his soil. And he wanted to use a different type of bedding in the barns to make it better for his crops. And he successfully negotiated with Sara Lee to make that change in the contract, right? And to be a better example for organic farmers. And presumably then for other contractors, right, who might do the same. He was feeling really good that he had made this change in what is a pretty unfriendly system for farmers. Small change, but he felt like it was a win, and it was a win for organic farmers, right? So when we think about Iowa's often there are two food streams, right? There are lots of places of confluence, right, where those streams come together. So that may mean that, things like health and safety concerns are similar across all types of farms. Farms maybe aren't as different as they seem initially, even though they serve two different systems. Or we can look at ways that farmers have taken different examples from these two types of farming and blended them on their own farm. I'll do organic production, but I'll also add turkey confinement. I'll negotiate, and maybe I can push some change. This farmer felt like he had made a change in a big system, right? I've made this system friendlier for organic farmers, right? And when they blend those systems, they can help articulate and explain how that might work. Barriers to change are more than just time and money. This was a fun little project. This was a student of mine who I advised in 2018. She herself came from a cattle production background. Her family raised cattle, and now she had married another farmer. There was all sorts of interesting stories about how two farm families merge when people are married and all the challenges. It's another lecture entirely. But she was really interested in why farmers might make changes in their operations to enhance safety, particularly with beef cattle, which is a little less industrialized isn't the right word. We haven't figured out how to grow cows in barns yet, right? We have not figured out yet a confinement system for cattle. I'm sure people are working on it, but we haven't gotten there yet. They are still outside, good for them. So she was interested in sort of what types of equipment farmers used and why they might not make changes that would be safer for them. So she designed this very long survey. I remember saying, oh, Deanne, this is so long. They will never fill this out. I was wrong. They did. So kudos to her. And then after she got the initial survey data, she did some targeted interviews and sort of walk through qualitative data collection with farmers, having them sort of talk through their process. And so in the initial data, the survey data, this is kind of a wonky figure, but so basically these three at the bottom, these are the most common, as they were selecting from options. Why don't you make changes in your operation? The most common was, the cost of equipment is too high. No surprise, we figured they'd say it was too expensive. I do not have time. We hear this from farmers all the time. I do not have time for this. And you know what I got works all right. It's fine. It's fine as it is. And then there were these other sort of, I don't own enough, I don't use it frequently, so it's not justified. Maybe my veterinarian provides most of it, et cetera. But we were interested in these top three. And I'm going to apologize in advance for the next slide because it's a lot of words, but it's okay. I will take you through it. So just don't panic. Don't leave. Don't leave. It's okay. So I use all these words for a couple of reasons. One, these came from our surveys. Farmers who often say they don't have time to sit down and fill out a data collection instrument sat down at their computers and took some time to tell us their whole story. And I was very surprised. But this comes from, so first they check the box. It costs too much, right? Okay, maybe I wouldn't have even had to go any farther. We could have eliminated the text part of the survey, because cost is too high. We would expect that. But then it gets interesting. So why haven't you made a change? Well, it was cost, but up until last year, the family had not been getting along very well. Because of this, we were unsure of what impacts this would have on the farm. Things are still on edge at times, so it has kind of been a trial run around here with this generation. I just don't know whether I want to put for the time, effort, and money, since I'm not even sure if there's going to be a farm in the coming years. So this is a different story than it just costs too much, right? This is a worry about it costs too much, but the cost isn't justified because of our interpersonal relationships right now. I'm worried about the farm. I'm anxious. I don't know if it's going to be there in the future. This isn't just it costs too much. Even though if all I'd given him was the checkbox, he'd say, it costs too much. But if you give him a chance to explain, you will learn that there are a lot of family dynamics that are anxiety-provoking, that are causing stress, that make him, and then that makes him not want to make a change in another part of his operation, right? Because of this stress. I always show these slides again for other researchers who work with farmers. Sometimes they will tell you a lot of things, even on the survey. And so we were curious as to sort of, if costs were not an issue, what would you like to change? And we got enormous, long descriptions. They had thought about this. They think about their procedures. They would think in great detail, how could I change how I move cattle, where I put them, all of those things. It was just interesting to sort of get that full perspective. So that's what all those other words are there, and I'm not going to read them to you. Again, sorry, stay put, stay with me. Lots of words, but it's okay. Again, what would you change? So much. But this was in response to, I don't have time. This would be another thing. Farmer says doesn't have time. And we're done. Nope, listen. He says, I don't really know how to get started. I'm not sure entirely what I would envision a redesign to look like in the operation. So that's part of the time too, right? You got to think about it. That's the pre-work. Blah, blah, blah. I also don't know who to go through about designing, right? He says, I can build it myself, but I would like to consult with someone about how to design it. So that's another time part of this, right? It's not just the actual, like, I got to bring the stuff and build the thing. It's like, I got to think about the thing before I even get there, right? Then he goes on, I also don't really want to talk with a salesman because I will always question their motives. Are they trying to help me or are they just trying to make a buck, right? So I have to think about this thing. That takes a lot of time. I think I need some help, but I don't know who to call for help, and I don't necessarily trust the initial people who I might call, right? So yeah, it's about time, but it's not just the time of construction. It's about the whole thing, and who do I put my trust in to help me through this process, right? It's about a lot more than just time. The other one we got a lot was, everything works well already, right? So this person says, I'm actually in the works now to move toward a more permanent setup in the what would you change question. But the reasons you haven't, the setup hasn't changed so far, mostly because it has worked well and hasn't necessitated a change. The other piece is, since the setup also hasn't changed because we've kicked around the idea of putting up a new facility. So we didn't want to invest much if it was just going to be changed entirely. So that's the other thing, right? These are farms that have a lot of different enterprises. I might make a change to one thing, but I'm going to maybe change this whole other thing. It's like a home renovation, right? I mean, we've all had this problem. Like, if do I fix this now, or do I wait until I do all these other things and fix this as part of that, right? So for now, it works fine, even though it may not be optimal, right? So again, this is sort of a blend of time and money, but part of it is it's sort of, right, it works well. So understanding barriers. Again, if we didn't give farmers the opportunity to really talk about it, either in the survey or in a walkthrough, as a researcher, the most instructive things, and I don't have time to do this as much as I used to, is to just spend time on farms with farmers and talk to them, have them describe their farms. They're always very excited to do it, right? They love to talk about their work. But you learn a lot. You learn a lot about what's behind these very simple, I don't have time, I don't have money, this works fine for me, which feels like, okay, we could leave it at that. We could. You could probably write a paper on it, but it wouldn't be very interesting, and it probably wouldn't really be very accurate, right? So when you think about costs, what other anxieties might be at play? What are the family dynamics that make that cost worth it or not? Lack of time can also be about lack of knowledge. And it's sometimes hard for farmers to articulate what they don't know. It's hard for all of us to articulate what we don't know. But listening to someone explain sort of, well, I don't really know how to design it and I don't know who to trust to help me design it. That's part of the time they're imagining that it would require to do this task. What I've got works well already. That's an interesting one because it's not untrue. It seems to be working fine for them. But collectively, most of them could describe in remarkable detail what they really wanted in a system. So they can see that there would be something that would work better for them. But there might be these other kind of barriers that are sort of, making it not worth it to make that shift, right? So read between the lines, ask for those longer responses. And finally, scientific questions need to matter to farmers. So this is a project I came in later on, as so often with qualitative researchers. Come help us. Can we talk to people? Yes, that would be great. So a colleague of mine, Matt Nonnenman, who is an industrial hygienist, and he had started a project in Texas when he was located there. It was a good project. It was a 5-year project, and it was an intervention designed to increase respirator use. Everybody knows what they are now, right? We didn't at the time. Nobody knew what it was. Among broiler chicken workers, so meat birds. And in Texas, like in Iowa, this is big barns, and throughout the South, poultry production is incredibly common in the southern U.S., more so than where we are in the Midwest, but the same type of production. So the big barns, the confinements, the working with contractors and contract firms, et cetera. So he started this work in 2011, and he started with a baseline survey to kind of understand. He wanted to help farmers target respirator use for when it was really needed, right? He didn't want to go in and say, you should wear your respirator every time you go in the chicken barn, because you know what they'd say? Whatever, right? It's not going to work. So instead, he wanted to take a more engaged approach, which I appreciate very much. And so he wanted to understand the type of work they do, and when would it be most important, right, to use a respirator? What kind of task would put you at the highest exposure risk for this dust? So we did the baseline survey, the task analysis, and then the third part of this project were targeted educational meetings, and they were meant to be peer-to-peer. They were do what you are always supposed to do when you get farmers together. You feed them, you do it over a meal, and you let farmers talk to one another, because they actually trust their peers very much, right? And so using these sort of collaborative meetings as a way for the educational intervention. I think pretty good. I was like, Matt, good job. This is a good project. So the problem was, let me go back to this slide actually. This went well. He got good responses on his survey. The task analysis went well. Then he started the targeted meetings. And guess what? Nobody came. Yeah. You throw a party and nobody comes. It's very sad. Poor Matt. So then but the other thing is like, we've got this federal money. We got to spend it. What do we do? Right? How do I finish my project? In the meantime, he was no longer located in Texas. He had moved to Iowa for a new position. So there were all these changes that had happened. I mean, that's the other thing about these long-term projects, as you all know, especially ones that are participatory. Your contacts may take on new jobs that will change the dynamic. You know, all these things happen. So he said, but we got to spend some federal money here because we got this project. So he said, all right, well, let's take a step back and ask a new question, which is about why farmers may or may not participate in research on their farms. Let's just ask them. We have some money to spend. We have some time. Why not? So we had some hunches. I will not say hypothesis. I will say hunch, because it's much less formal than a hypothesis. We thought maybe they worried that federally funded research might lead to regulation. That's certainly something we hear. Farmers' fears of being regulated by the government. They do not like that, and they don't want research to lead to it. We thought it might be about privacy and keeping people off their farm. It's certainly a possibility. Also, the time question. This was before I did my research on the cattle thing about time, but like not having enough time was a consideration. We thought maybe those are some of the reasons. And we wanted to ask questions very broadly. We wound up doing phone interviews, which was another time I was proved wrong about how to engage with farmers. I was worried people wouldn't want to speak with us on the phone. They were happy to talk. We must have caught them all at a good time, because boy, did they talk. We worked with a group on our University of Iowa campus who actually did the interviews. We spent a lot of time training those interviewers about follow-up questions and things like that. But it wound up being a good phone interview. And we asked sort of just broad questions about, interest in reducing dusts, what might prevent you from participating in safety or health-related research on your farm. We also asked them, as you often do, you sometimes ask the same question from different angles. We also asked them to say, why do you think farmers wouldn't want, maybe it's not about you, but maybe envision why farmers more broadly wouldn't want this kind of work. Do you think the integrators, and the integrators, that's the common term, at least in the broiler industry, for those contract firms, for the Sara Lees and the Smithfields, those are the companies that they deal with, right? So do you think the integrators are supportive of the research? What do you think some of the challenges would be? So we had a list of questions. My point here is just to show that they're just pretty open-ended. Nowhere did we say anything about regulation. No, we didn't want to put those ideas in their mind. We really wanted to hear their responses, things that came to their mind. The theme that came up most frequently was about trust, right? So when we looked at these, now I'm trying to remember how many interviews we wound up with. I think just over 30. So issues of research bias, trusting the research agenda. They had a lot of comments about what might the research be about. The company or the integrator was referenced, but not as much as we thought it would be. That was not the key thing. Trusting the knowledge of the researchers and how well they're known to the informant. Did you all have the Muppets here in Slovenia? I'm sorry, this is a very American reference. Okay, nobody trusts this. Yeah, okay, good. You get the joke then. Yeah, okay. I didn't think to change that. So some of the comments we got, so again, sorry, some text here, about research and bias and agenda. I think the most important thing is to build that trust back, make them know, the farmer know, that the research wants what is best for the industry or for the farmer, right? So what's your end game here, researcher? What is it you want and what's in it for me, right? This matters. You're gonna come take my knowledge, you're gonna come learn about what's happening on my farm. What do I get from it, right? And don't tell me that in 10 years down the road we'll have something different, because it needs to be a little more immediate than that, right? So issue of trust in sort of where research has gone and the perception that research isn't always in the best interest of the farmer, right? So they're worried about that. So the question was, what would help, what would facilitate doing research on farm? And these were all very brief comments, but they're very instructive. Well, it depends upon what type of research is involved, right? I need to know your methods. You need to be upfront about what the research is for. What is your end game? I would want to look at the objectives of the study. I want to understand what questions precisely you're asking. And then if it was for the right reason, I do it on my farm, which means you as a researcher, you need to think about, well, what's the right reason here? How do we make this mutually beneficial? What does it mean to be the right reason for a farmer? What did they fear our agenda was? Not unlike the comments about the beef cattle and sort of who do I trust. They were worried that we wanted to make a sales pitch. They actually were much less, when we got to sort of the point in the interview instrument where we were asking a little more specifically about respirator use and dust exposure, their concern was that we were going to try to sell them a particular kind of respirator, which was not the case at all, right? That wasn't even one of our hunches, like that it was going to be a sales pitch, but that's what came out of it. They were also worried about studies being useless, right? So the idea that you're just doing this research and why? Why? I mean, we've all asked ourselves that. I know. We can all have a support group later. But what is the purpose of this study? Why? What is the use? They want it to be something concrete. And there were some comments about regulation, and particularly references to the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the usually, and this is certainly true in Iowa as well, that farmers are concerned that the EPA is going to tell them not to, poison our water, which is not a bad idea, but again, another lecture. The other thing was trusting in the researcher's knowledge. So again, it sort of kind of aligns, I think, with the use of the study. I like this quote very much. When there's something that's being suggested that's so impossible to do, then you lose faith in the person doing the questioning. You think they absolutely don't know what they're talking about, and you don't want to deal with them. So the reality is, many researchers, many people, we don't necessarily have farm experience. We don't know what their daily life looks like. So for someone to come in from the outside and say, well, this is what you need to do, they're very like, wait, you need to understand my world a little bit, right? You can't just make these, decisions. I will say, in retrospect, I think we didn't do enough in this interview actually to talk about what a respirator is and isn't. Again, we all know now. We've all been through COVID. Everybody knows what the mask, the N95. But I think sometimes when we said respirator, they were imagining like the whole thing, yeah, the scuba gear or something, and sort of, again, new safety regulations won't allow us to think outside of the box anymore because boxes have sharp corners, right? So proposing things that don't make sense in the work environment, and farmers are really attentive to those proposals. Trusting the researcher's knowledge. This is one of my favorite responses. We said, why do you think growers wouldn't come to these events? And the guy says, well, if you know anything about farmers, you know that they don't get together a lot. I was like, that's a nice little data point there. If you know anything about farmers. So trusting in similar to sort of the previous slide, and what makes sense for them, right? What do you know about their work, about their experience, and so that you can make proposals that are actually work in their favor. This used to be on calendars when I was a kid. You'd get them from the feed store, you'd get a calendar, and I always remember that picture. It's my favorite. I've been farming along. They also questioned our questions, as farmers tend to do. So when we asked them about, do you think farmers are interested in reducing dust or reducing exposure? They said, I don't know, our work is not that dangerous. we really don't have any major things. We have dust in the houses and there's a chance of falling and getting cut or hurt. We don't have any major challenges. Now, what you want to say and you bite your tongue as a researcher is, oh my gosh, yes you do. Occupational injuries are very high in farming, right? But the farmers are saying, look, our work isn't that hard. It's not that dangerous. I don't see where there are a lot of hazards, really. There are just 2 of us on the farm. Most of it is handwork. As long as you don't let the forklift run over you, you're in good shape. Well, fair, I agree. Don't let the forklift run over you. Also, we're pretty simple-minded and we don't like when things get too complicated. They're like, hey, this is common sense, right? I don't feel like we really need to do research on respirators. We use them when we need to. I feel like we can take care of it on our own. We were asked, questions about respirators were sort of like, why are you asking this? This is common sense. We know this, right? So how is it even a valid scientific question? This is just common sense. So in reflecting on these responses, which were so interesting, it also caused us to reflect a lot on sort of the trajectory of agriculture in research overall. So in the US, we talk about scientific agriculture now. It is part of our lexicon, right? But that means production-oriented research. And that took a while to get there, right? So the history of agricultural science is actually very interesting because there were a lot of researchers who wanted to help farmers, and farmers, this is in the early 1900s, and farmers were like, go away and leave me alone, I'm doing fine. Why are you bothering me? And it wasn't until agricultural science aligned with production goals that we really saw a move forward in agricultural science. And what I'm talking about are sort of our extension services, our agronomists, these other fields that really do work on farm production. And where they aligned was, I'm gonna help you make more money. Now that I can get on board with, right? Public health, it's a little harder to make that argument, right? I can't say if you use this respirator, you're gonna make more money. I might say, you're less likely to die young, if that's what you want, right? And they're like, that's so, right? It's a harder argument to make. So as we're thinking about safety and health research and science related to agriculture, and I would say this is true in sort of the occupational safety, but also mental and behavioral health, right? We're coming into an industry that has been around for many generations, and where farmers are truly the experts in the system, right? And so it's not until our public health science can figure out how we align our goals with their goals, I think that we're going to be more successful. And I don't think we've quite done that yet as researchers. Not in the US, certainly. We're still working on it. I think we're getting better. And we have a lot more participatory methods and ways that actually bring farmers' perspectives into things. That's sort of new. But we have a ways to go, right? But it is very reminiscent. When I read those comments and then I look back at the literature on sort of the trajectory of agricultural science, I thought, we are there now, right? Public health science now in the US is where agricultural science was 100 years ago. So we have some work to do. And my favorite quote, this was also in the broiler chicken study. Good luck with your research. I hope you find what you're looking for, right? It tells you what their perception of our research is, right? It's such a beautiful, it's like, oh, there it is, right? My favorite. Yeah. So how do we think about this? How do we apply these lessons, if they are that, to sort of farmer well-being research or other health research? First, I'd say, remember, you have to place farmers in their social and political contexts, right? They are not independent actors. I'm gonna bet that's true here too. I think it's true anywhere, right? And those social political contexts are very important, and cultural contexts, right? One of my favorite farmer jokes is, a couple is at a gathering and somebody asks the farmer, well, how do you know when to plant? And the farmer goes on, well, I look and I have this research and that research. And after he walks away, his wife goes over and she says, that's not true. He just looks at what the neighbor is doing, right? Yeah, just sort of, farming is very public. So that cultural context is very, very important. And so our interventions for well-being need to include those actors as well. We need to understand the political context. Maybe you need representatives from agribusiness or some of those other entities that inform farming. They're generally pretty good partners with some barriers, but thinking holistically about the context. I think it's important. I like looking for common concerns across different types of farms and thinking, as in the US, we tend to kind of pit you're this kind of farmer or that kind of farmer. And I just think those distinctions are not actually all that helpful. And in fact, if you look across farms, I think too, Dushka and I were talking earlier, wouldn't it be fun to get a bunch of American and Slovenian farms just in the room and let them talk to each other? Because I bet we would find that they have a lot more in common than we would imagine, even despite our very different topographical and production and political contexts. Listen carefully for the real concern. It's very easy to sort of say, farmers don't have time. I hear this among researchers a lot. I was sort of joking. I know when I've met someone who's just started doing research in farming is they tell me that, well, you can't do that research in the spring because they're very busy. And I think, oh, you learned that. Good job, right? Like, we're all busy, first of all. And there are a lot more than just that, right? So moving beyond those initial, it's too much, it's too expensive, right? There are more complex concerns that I think if we're doing our work well, we will really dig into. And then finally, farmers probably have their own ideas about your research. And they actually probably also have really good questions. And if you listen to those, I think it helps us a lot move those forward. And then you're really responding to their concerns, not what you perceive their concerns to be. So I'm a big advocate of the participatory approach. I think, you made it. Whew. And I confess, I've not been paying attention to time, so I'm sorry if I've kept you through your lunch.
Thank you very much, Brandi. It was really good. Yeah, we can learn a lot because we're doing the same mistakes, so to speak, because now we would like to persuade farmers that they need mental health programs for the first aid, mental health first aid and so on. It's a very difficult thing because not only because of stigma and everything, that they're not crazy and so on, they need normal prices, not psychological support, but really how to approach them, how to include them in all these projects and programs. It is really a challenge, I'm sure. Okay, I don't want to talk a lot. I would like to open floor for discussion, and I think that, probably you have some questions, comments.
You may just want to go take a nap.
Yeah,
that's okay too.
yeah, sorry.
Thank you. This was really, really interesting. You mentioned the subsidies. And they have there are 5 crops that are subsidized. And I just would like to ask, is this a federal thing or it depends on the state?
This is federal, but it is organized through the states. It's very complicated. So our federal farm bill has programs for these 5 subsidized commodities. Then those are distributed through the states. So you go there is an office in every county called the Farm Service Agency. That's part of our United States Department of Agriculture. As a farmer, you go in every year and you sign up for your subsidy programs. There has been a change from so the Farm Bill, which is our big piece of legislation, happens every 5 years. The previous Farm Bill, and for many years prior, subsidies were just payments. I grow corn, I grow this many acres of corn, I get a check this big. People finally started saying, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And so it has now changed to where it looks a little bit more like an insurance program, which is there is a price determined, right, based on sort of commodity futures and other calculations. And if you are not able to sell at that price, the government makes up for the gap, basically. And that's based on local data. It was kind of a mess in the rollout because there were differences between counties, and it's taken some time to figure it out. And I would say it hasn't resulted in really any difference in the amount that farmers get. Agribusiness and sort of the players were surprisingly quiet about the change, which tells me that it's not really a change, because if it was going to be a change, they would have been very loud about it. But yeah, so you go into your county office and sign up for the program, but ultimately the money comes from the federal government. Does that?
Yeah. What about the organic farming? Is it also separate kind of stipulations?
Yes.
And do they differ among states also because of environmental factors maybe?
Yeah, they differ. There are less subsidies for organic production. And in fact, I don't think that organic corn and soybeans are subsidized at all in the same way because they're higher margins. So they figure you can make more money on organics. And there are no subsidies for food production, for vegetables and fruit. Even one challenge, so there's the subsidies, and then we also do have subsidized crop insurance programs. So if we have a flood and I'm a corn farmer, I can make up that loss in income. It's actually really hard in the Midwest to start those programs for vegetable farmers because we don't have the data to know what it's worth, if that makes sense. So every acre of corn, like we know exactly how much corn is going to grow there because we've been keeping track of that corn and we know everything about the production. But if I'm a farmer who sells to a farmer's market and I've got 5 acres of production in a whole mix of vegetables that I sell at the farmer's market, my insurance agent says, I don't know what that is worth. We don't have the data to know those benchmarks. So the alternative farmers are lacking significantly in those same support programs. And the argument is generally, well, they're selling something at a higher price, they get a better margin on it, so they're making more money, and their insurance is their diversity. So if my broccoli fails, I can sell lettuce or something like that, which is not always true, but that's just sort of where we are. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a
Yeah.
small question, just my curiosity. Do you have problems with feral hogs there?
With
Feral hogs.
oh, feral hawks. Yeah, they'll get your
Like
chickens.
in Texas, for example.
Well, so if I was a big Texas chicken grower, all my chickens would be in a house, and so the hawks would not get them.
Hogs.
Feral hogs. Thank you. I thought you said hawks, like raptors.
No, yeah,
Hogs.
no, hogs.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Right.
In the South, yes. Thank you for the clarification. We're talking about 2 completely different animals. Yeah.
Of course.
Yes, in the South, there are feral hog. There's an interesting discussion right now about whether or not they should be hunted in some places. And some people would say, yes, of course, hunt them because it will get rid of them. And other people say, no, because if you open it up to hunting, hunters are actually very good conservationists. So as soon as they start hunting something, they want to maintain the habitat for the thing that they're hunting. So it will actually make the problem worse. So yes, it is not so much where I am in Iowa, but in the South, for sure. And it's a really interesting discussion. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Maya, did you have a question?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for a very interesting lecture and all your efforts you made in your research. So I believe and understand that this work is very demanding, very hard, very exhaustive, but also very adorable at the end. When I was listening to you, I was then thought actually you created so much knowledge, so much interesting information, and this was, let's say, the question, the answers to your questions. But I'm interesting to hear about how this knowledge then is used. On the higher level. Let's say the system is very hierarchy and not only horizontal. So how, let's say, policymakers are taken into account your knowledge, your results, and to make the benefits of farmers.
Oh, yeah, that's a lovely thought, isn't it? I am an anthropologist, which means they rarely listen to us. But so I would say I have moments. So I think the center that I direct, it has been around longer than I have, which I'm lucky for. And it does give us a bit of a platform to talk with policymakers. We have on our ICASH has an advisory board that includes farmers and agribusiness, but also some policymakers, which I see as a value that they can sort of hear from what stakeholders in this area are saying. I will say I was pleasantly, I guess, surprised to be asked to speak with, every U.S. state has 2 senators. Our 2, of course, are very involved in federal agricultural processes. We are just beginning the process of renegotiating the new farm bill. And so Joni Ernst, who's one of our senators in Iowa, her staff asked to meet with me and say, well, what can we do in the next farm bill to support farmer health and well-being, which was a lovely opportunity. I don't know that she'll listen to what I said, but because my argument is we have to change the structure, not just do things at the end of the road. So what they really want to do is say, let's invest in counseling services. Those are really important, and I don't want to say they're not important, but if this is occupational stress, we have to think about the system. And if you're writing a farm bill, you have some power to do that. So that was my argument to them, to think about, say, our subsidy programs. Can we create meaningful diversity in those? So as a farmer, I have a choice not to grow corn. I actually have some control over my operation. That would be a big change, right? And I think it would have some benefits on health and well-being. We're also advocating for more research, right? So if you want to understand, you know, let's do better research and, you know, embed that research into some of these policies. So there are moments when I think there might be some ways to talk with policymakers, but it's fits and starts, you know? It's fits and starts.
So here in Slovenia is, we are so down.
Just tomorrow.
Yeah.
Tomorrow she has a presentation for stakeholders here in Slovenia
We'll see.
for minister and everybody.
Tell me what I'm supposed to tell them. I'll get them to, I'll say they should listen to you all. Maybe that should be my first message.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you for your beautiful lecture. I would like to ask, what do you think? Would farmers stay on their farms in West and North, globally, if there would not be subsidies?
What would happen if we pulled the subsidy system away?
All around.
Yeah, I've asked myself that question. It's a very interesting one. I mean, I'm not an economist, so you get only my perceptions as an anthropologist. I think it would change, it would be painful. Be like ripping off the Band-Aid, right? I do think, though, that we would learn that we can, as I observe our alternative farmers, working in systems where they have less subsidy support, they are more flexible, they can respond to consumers differently. We could rebuild a regional food system where there are markets for produce in the US, I'm thinking. However, what does that mean? But we're in a global, this is science fiction, right? I mean, I'm visioning here because we're in this global economy, and our subsidies really support our farmers' export. I mean, we're exporting, you know, a great portion of our corn crop, and it's going into non-food. It's going into our gas tanks in the form of ethanol, which is bizarre. It's very strange. So we're always going to need farmers, right? I mean, we do eat. That's not going to change. So if the subsidy system's vanished, I would imagine that we would eventually figure out how to rebuild regional systems it would undermine the global system for sure, because I think our subsidies really support that global export system. But it would be a very, very painful transition. Yeah. But it's one thing I lay awake at night and I think about. What if the subsidies were gone? What would happen? I don't know. That's my guess. So.
Thank you. I have a question, comment?
Yes.
Thank you for your interesting and inspiring lecture. I have a question. You mentioned that the systems, why the link between the producers on the one hand, the farmers, and the consumers have been weakened, are kind of invisible, and sometimes this is being done on purpose. Could you elaborate a bit on this?
My conspiracy
theories.
Yeah, I think. I want to think about a moment before I speak. Again, because we have this system where most of us buy food from farmers who are very far away, but we have ideas about what that farm looks like, right? You know, if you go to the U.S. to the grocery store and you buy a package of butter and there's happy cows on the butter, the chickens are very happy, pigs, right? So consumers are really distanced from what production really looks like. It's not our stories. I mean, all of us in the U.S. when we were kids, there are a number of children's books that are about farms, right? And they're these beautiful, there's a couple of pigs and there's a few cows and everybody's happy and it's very green, right? But farming is really, it has become an industrialized process, so it looks very different. And consumers are very distanced from that. And probably if they knew more about it, they would be less comfortable with it than they are. I will say one interesting thing that has just happened in the United States. Voters in California voted for, it was called Proposition 12, and it was that California would no longer sell pork that was raised in conditions where we had what we call gestation crates. So these are these small spaces for sows as they give birth to piglets, and they can't, they don't have a lot of space. Ostensibly, this is to keep the sow from squashing her own babies because she will lay on them. But at any rate, it's very upsetting to consumers when they realize that an animal is being held in a space that, So voters said you can't sell pork that have been raised in those conditions anymore in the state of California. People in Iowa, they're furious about it because it's a huge market for us, right? We're the one who grow all the pigs, right? And the consumers have now spoken up and said, we don't want these production conditions. And interestingly, despite the fact that agribusiness often tells us how consumer-oriented agriculture is, they're real mad about this. Like everybody's, oh, it's gonna cause this huge price shift, and these people don't know anything about farming. We are the experts, right? We're hearing this in this discussion. So the problem is when consumers do know something about agriculture, they ask for change. And there are lots of parts of the system that don't want to change. So yes, I do think it's somewhat purposeful. We also have some of our states are trying with policies, we call them ag-gag laws, that prevent people from like photographing production practices, right? So sometimes our activists will maybe try to get a job at a farm or something and then take pictures of conditions and share the conditions, and this upsets farmers and it causes all this trouble. So they're trying to legislate it that you can't do that anymore. Mostly we have pretty robust free speech laws, so those tend to have been, I think they've mostly been knocked down. But yeah, I do think that the distance between farmers and consumers benefits a lot of sort of corporate practices that when consumers realize what production looks like, they often don't like it, they're uncomfortable with it, and they push back against it. And then the concern is there's less money, right? So, yeah. Yeah.
Any other?
Any other?
More questions, comments?
Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Okay, then,
Wonderful.